Hey guys, today we're going to go over another game in the Bishop's Opening. This game wasn't particularly long, but it certainly did evolve past the opening phases of the game into something pretty interesting that I wanted to share. And I think there's a couple of key lessons that can be learned from this game as well. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. And the Bishop's Opening starts with e4 and Bishop c4. Black plays knight f6 here, and after d4, black plays knight to c6. Now, I could have played d5 here. And after the knight moves out of the way, I could have retreated the bishop to d3 here, and this is a pretty good position for white, mostly because of how badly positioned this knight is. But I chose not to do that in this game, so I played just knight f3 here. So after that, black actually captures the pawn on d4, and I recaptured. And this is a slight inaccuracy here for me. So a lot of times in the Bishop's Opening, we kind of want to tempt our opponents to grab this pawn on e4 here. And a lot of times what happens is, after that move, we have the d5 square available for our queen to move to kind of threaten checkmate and also pick up this loose knight here on e4. It happens pretty frequently in the Bishop's Opening. Unfortunately, in this position, it doesn't actually completely work. So obviously our knight is in the way here. So if our opponent had grabbed the pawn on e4, if we trade the knights, well, this pawn now recapturing actually prevents our queen from coming to the d5 square and putting pressure on the knight. So in this position, we're actually basically just down a pawn, even though we're slightly up in terms of development. We're about ready to castle, but it's not worth it for white here. So actually, a better move for me would have been either playing e5 or just straight up castling here. But my opponent did not grab the pawn on e4. Instead, they moved their knight, attacking my bishop, the white bishop. So I just simply retreated the bishop. And there was a couple developing moves here early on. We both castled, centralized the rook. I developed my knight. And now my opponent plays a pretty interesting move here, which is knight to g4. And I played f3. I thought this was a good, opportunity to simply just kick the knight away. Even though this is potentially setting up some issues here with this pin, I thought this knight would be forced to retreat. And you might notice that this f3 move kind of swung the eval bar into black's favor here. So we're going to flip the board, and it's a good time to just give a little puzzle here for you guys if you would like. If you would like to, pause the game and see if you can figure out, playing with the black pieces here, how to capitalize on this f3 move. And I'll give you guys a couple seconds. Okay. So the correct move here is a kind of a funky looking one. It's actually queen to h4, which, it does seem interesting. So obviously we're threatening a pretty nasty attack here on h2. And just to make this kind of clear, if white completely ignores this threat for some reason, this isn't just a nasty attack, it's actually checkmate, forced checkmate. So the white king is going to be forced here to e2, and then queen to g2 is actually just checkmate here. So obviously white has to respond to this. And it seems like a pretty obvious response. We've got the pawn on f3 here already attacking the knight. If we take the knight, then this is no longer a threat here, right? So let's see what happens if white takes the knight on g4, which is absolutely what I would have done in this position. So the problem here is kind of twofold. They're kind of related to each other for white. But the first is that this bishop has not been developed yet. And the secondly, because of that, this queen here on d1 is what is known as overloaded in her defense. So what this means is that the queen is the sole defender for two pieces in this position. We can see that the black queen is attacking the rook. And we can see that the bishop here is attacking the knight. So in this position, if black plays bishop captures the knight here, this is kind of equalizing the material considering we just lost our knight. The thing is that white cannot grab this bishop. If white grabs this bishop, this queen gives up her defense of the rook here, and not only that, but this actually forces checkmate. So white cannot capture this bishop. So now being equal on material, let's say white simply moves out of the check that's provided by the bishop. Well, then black is gonna go ahead and grab this pawn on g4, and this should seem kind of familiar because we're in the exact same position we were in, basically. This knight is here, this queen is still here threatening a nasty attack, and now this bishop's got a wide open lane here. So it would have been a very deadly move for black to make. Very high level, I think, high level tactic, considering, you know, the overloading here. But the point is, you have to develop your minor pieces, because if this bishop was no longer here, and we continue this train of thought here, if this bishop was no longer here, well, then these rooks are connected, and this is no longer a checkmating threat. This whole attack doesn't work. So, important to make sure you stay up on your development, basically, is the key to that position. So, with all that being said, my opponent did not play queen to h4. Instead, he simply retreated the knight back to f6, which is what I was hoping he would do. I took this opportunity to pin the knight here with bishop to g5. My opponent plays h6, and I simply retreat the bishop. Now, my opponent could have played g5 here, but I felt confident that I could maintain this pin because black is already castled here. And typically, when your opponent's already castled, they're not going to want to greatly weaken the spaces in front of their king with all these pawn moves. Now, in some instances, it's actually a good move to play g5. In this one particularly, it's not a bad move, but it's not something that black feels comfortable with, especially in games where you don't have a lot of time to kind of think in positions. So, with that being said, my opponent did not play g5, he played a6. And a6 is a little bit of an interesting, perplexing move. I would say it doesn't really accomplish much. I'm thinking maybe my opponent is possibly trying to pawn storm on the queen side or something like that. But it's a slow move, it doesn't really do much. So I took that opportunity to jump up my knight to d5 here. And you'll notice I'm making black a little bit uncomfortable already with this double attack here on the knight on f6. Black has two defenders, but it's important to note who the defenders are. One is the queen, and one is this pawn here on g7, which is very important, in keeping this position in front of the king stable. So, although this looks dangerous, at the moment it still isn't. What black should be playing here is either g5 or retreating the knight back here, back to d7 to defend this knight. Because you want to mitigate this attack here. So g5 would cut off the bishop scope. Retreating the knight would add another defender here. But he didn't do that. So we'll see what the issue is with this. So my opponent played c6 after I jumped up the knight. And this is just a move too late. If he had played it before I jumped the knight up, then I wouldn't have been able to jump the knight here. But as it stands, he plays c6. And now I'm able to kind of totally screw up the pawns in front of black's king. And that's because of the defenders, a pawn and a queen. So whenever that's the case, and we trade here, black cannot take with the queen, obviously, because if he does, I'm going to win that queen, right? So what this is doing is it's forcing black to screw up the pawns in front of the king. And that's a pretty big advantage, I would say, in these types of games. So we'll see how this continues here. Okay, I immediately played queen to d2, threatening this pawn here and totally ruining the space around my opponent's king. So this is something that my opponent has to respect. The thing is also to keep in mind is that my queen is actually important on this file because she is the only defender of this knight on d4. So she can't move quite yet. And if this bishop takes the knight, well, he's also delivering check. So that's a tempo as well. So that's important to note. So after queen to d2, my opponent defended with the king. And I played king to h1. I wanted to get out of this pin. So what this does is basically free up this knight here in d4 to get into the game. Probably to f5. Note that it doesn't add a defender, though, to the knight. So if I move the queen, this knight is still undefended. Okay, my opponent played rook to g8. I think he doesn't want to allow a lot of shenanigans on this file, considering the king is vulnerable here. But this does weaken up another pawn in black's territory. We'll see how that's exploited in a little bit. So I went ahead and played f4 here. Now, The thing is that this rook move weakened the f7 pawn. The only defender of the f7 pawn is now this knight. And we've already got an attacker on this f7 pawn, which is the bishop here on b3. And f4 is basically trying to force black to give up a pawn. And I think these couple moves already are building up pressure after this, this ruining of the pawn structure here. I think black was starting to feel a little bit, and he tried to trade some material here to kind of relieve some pressure, but it doesn't quite work. So after we trade knight for bishop here, my opponent played c5, and I just keep my queen on this diagonal here. Now the point is, we've got an attacker on the knight, we've got an attacker on the pawn. Not only that, but if this knight moves, we've also got two attackers on this f6 pawn as well, which is also weak. So a lot of issues here in black's position. And here, black played knight to g4, which tries to accomplish a couple things at once. He's trying to move the knight out of the attack and also defend this weak f6 pawn. Unfortunately, this move kind of just doesn't work because after h3, there's nowhere for the knight to go. These two pawns of my opponent's pawns are cutting off his retreat, and there's nowhere else for him to go. So my opponent plays rook to g7, I guess noticing this weak pawn, but of course we can go ahead and grab the knight now, which is hanging here. And that's done. So we trade a pawn for the knight, which is great for us, but now I'll let you guys finish this game off. Can you find the correct move for white to just kind of put this game away? Okay, so the correct move is bishop to f6. We already kind of talked about this weak pawn here, lined up with the queen. And not only does this win an extra pawn, but it's also forking the rook and the queen. So in this position, my opponent resigned the game. Obviously, this game went well beyond the, just being a bishop's opening game. I think key takeaways from the original puzzle were make sure you defend your, develop your pieces in the early game. But the other thing here is, I think there's opportunities here. Now, a lot of times these attacks with, a pinned knight aren't all that scary if your opponent makes the correct moves. But a lot of times they don't make the correct moves here. And if you have a chance to mess up the pawns in front of your king, your opponent's king, you should take it. So this is something that I see quite often in my games, at least. So it's definitely something to consider and think about. That being said, this game wasn't over for black, really, until this move occurred with the knight on g4. The best moves here either would have been, you're already down initiative, you're feeling the pressure. So black could have either retreated the knight back here and simply given up the pawn, or played c4, kind of cutting off this attack and forcing a trade here. Again, for a pawn, so we'd be up a pawn as white, but that kind of would help them relieve the pressure instead of trying to hold on to everything at once, which is just not possible in this position where there are just so many weaknesses. So that was black's biggest problem here. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.